All right, we're continuing following the evolution of plants, and if you'll recall, we've covered the groups that are non-vascular spore producing. Those are the mosses. Then we moved on to the vascular spore producing. Those are the ferns. And now we're going to take a look at the seed plants. And along with seed goes pollen, so make sure you make that note. Seeds and pollen kind of evolved at the same time, evolved together. And they both evolved mainly to free plants from the requirement of water for reproduction. If you'll recall, in both the mosses and the ferns, in both the bryophytes and the pterophytes, water is necessary for the sperm to swim to the egg. Without water, they can't reproduce, so that limits where they can live. Seed plants, on the other hand, the pollen in seed plants, the pollen specifically is how the sperm can get to the egg without water. Because as you know, pollen can blow in the wind and pollen can be carried by animals. So that was a huge evolutionary advancement. Likewise, seeds are more advanced than spores because they can remain dormant for a long time, and as they're dormant, they can be dispersed far and wide. So they can be dispersed not only by wind, because spores are primarily dispersed by wind. Seeds can be dispersed by animals, and there are other mechanisms too, but that's the advantage of seeds. Dormancy and dispersal. So these vascular seed and pollen plants are now the dominant group of plants on the planet. There are more species than the bryophytes and the pterophytes put together. Far more species. And but the first to evolve were the gymnosperms, what we now refer to as the gymnosperms. And gymnosperm means naked seed. And the reason they call them naked seed is because the seeds develop on the surface of cones. In other words, they're not surrounded by other cells and other tissues and protected within any tissues. They're on the surface of cones, just like we're seeing here. And so the gymnosperms are divided up into four main phyla anyway. We've got the phylum Coniferophyta, Cicadophyta, Ginkgophyta, and Gnetophyta. So these are the common names. We just commonly refer to them as conifers and cycads and ginkgos and gnetophytes. But those represent the four phyla as well, and we'll be looking at those on another slide. But what we're looking at here is a cycad, and these cycads can grow to be the size of trees, just like pine trees. Conifers are pine trees, basically. So as you know, we call them pine trees, so they grow the size of trees. So we'll be looking at each of these phyla. The other group of vascular seed and pollen-producing plants are known as angiosperms, and those are the flowering plants. And when we're talking about the dominant group and the success of these seed-producing plants, seed and pollen plants, angiosperms are the absolute dominant because there are more species of angiosperms than the bryophytes and the pterophytes and the gymnosperms all put together. So flowering plants are actually the most successful kinds of plants on the planet at this point in evolution. And they are a clade. They are a monophyletic group in one phylum, and that's the phylum Anthophyta. So gymnosperms are divided up into these four phyla, but angiosperms are all in one phylum, and that's Anthophyta, which is, of course, subclassified from there. And by the way, angio means covered or contained. So these are not naked seeds. These are contained seeds or covered seeds. And we're going to look at the gymnosperms first in particular, and that's what or at least what we're going to finish up with today. But we're also going to start out with what seed plants have in common. So we'll just be kind of going through, what seeds are and so forth. And pollen. Don't forget the pollen. So like all plants, the seed-producing and pollen-producing plants show alternation of generations. But remember, I've been trying to relate to you that this relationship between the haploid gametophyte and diploid sporophyte has changed throughout evolution. And by the time we get here to the seed plants, the gametophyte has been greatly reduced. The sporophyte is completely dominant. In other words, when you see a flowering plant or a cone-producing plant, a gymnosperm or an angiosperm, a seed plant, what you're looking at is the sporophyte. And to see the gametophyte now, you would need a microscope. That's not the way it was in the non-vascular spore-producing or the vascular spore-producing plants. If you'll recall the gametophyte, you can actually see with the naked eye, and it's a separate plant. In this case, the gametophyte is just a few cells that's contained within the sporophyte tissue. And as I pointed out on the previous slide, the great thing about pollen and seeds is it frees plants from the need of water. So they don't need water for the sperm to get to the egg. That's what pollen's all about. And the seeds also can be dispersed in more ways than just by the wind. So we're talking about seeds being produced in either flowers or cones, depending on whether we're talking about angiosperms or gymnosperms. The transfer of sperm by pollen, and of course, that's known as pollination. And then the protection of embryos and seeds. I mean, that's what seeds contain. That's the important things that seeds contain. Seeds contain the embryo and protects the embryo and allows the embryo to remain dormant for long periods of time, even like 500 years, before they will find a suitable place to germinate and grow. So it's all about pollen and seeds, and pollen is the male gametophyte. And the female gametophyte is what's known as an embryo sac, which is within ovules, within an ovary, if we're talking about angiosperms anyway. Gymnosperms don't have ovaries, but they do have ovules, and they do have embryo sacs. So the female gametophyte is this thing called an embryo sac, and it contains the egg, but it also contains other cells. So it's a multicellular structure, but it contains the egg, and once the egg is fertilized, the embryo sac is what is going to develop, and the whole ovule that it's contained within is going to become the seed. So that's the female gametophyte, just a few cells. And if we're talking about angiosperms, flowering plants, this seed is developing within an ovule, within an ovary, within the flower, within the female reproductive parts of a flower. If we're talking about the male pollen, it's the male gametophyte, and it's developing within the male parts of a flower, the anthers of a flower. And again, that one pollen grain is the male gametophyte. And as it says here, what it contains is a generative cell, which is going to give rise to sperm. And then there's a tube cell, and the generative cell is inside a tube cell. So there's one cell inside another cell here. And the tube cell is going to form what's known as a pollen tube, and that's what's going to actually transport the sperm to the egg at the time of pollination. And remember, the gametophyte is haploid, and this is taking place, the development of these structures, these gametophytes, is taking place inside the diploid sporophyte, but these cells are haploid. So all the 8 cells, including the egg within the embryo sac, are haploid cells, and the 2 cells within each pollen grain are haploid cells. And they're the only haploid cells in the whole life cycle of a vascular seed and pollen-producing plant. So what is a seed? Well, again, it has to do with the 2 Ds, dormancy and dispersal. So we've got the embryo that's contained within the seed. That's the important part of the seed. And that embryo, that represents the sporophyte. In other words, it is the sporophyte. The embryo is the sporophyte plant that when the seed germinates, that's what's going to grow into the sporophyte that you see when you're looking at seed plants. You look out the window and what you're seeing are sporophytes. It's the result of the fertilization of the egg inside the embryo sac, which is the female gametophyte. So it's once it's fertilized, it's a zygote, and the zygote starts to divide, and it develops to a certain point as an embryo, a multicellular embryo, but then it stops its development, and it's dormant. And it can stay dormant for, like I said, hundreds of years even. Then along with the embryo is a food supply, and in flowering plants, that food supply is known as the endosperm. So I'm just introducing that term now. And then surrounding the whole thing is this protective seed coat. And it mainly keeps the seed from drying out, because if the seed completely dries out and there's no moisture whatsoever, the embryo will die. So the seed coat's really important in making sure that seed can remain dormant for a long time. So that's the dormancy part of it. And the dispersal part of it, The seed plants are divided up into gymnosperms and angiosperms, and the gymnosperms are producing seeds on cones, and the seeds then are primarily dispersed by wind. They're going to drop from the cones. The cones are going to open up and release the seeds, and they're going to blow away for the most part. So a lot of the seeds that come from gymnosperms are going to have little wings on them to help in their dispersal by wind. But they're really not going to go that far. They are also dispersed somewhat by animals, because there are, animals like squirrels like to eat pine nuts, just like we like to eat pine nuts. So they'll help disperse the seeds to some extent. But for the most part, it's by wind. When it comes to flowering plants, and one of the great successes of the flowering plants is how both flowers and the fruits that develop from flowers are utilizing animals for both the dispersal of pollen and the dispersal of the seeds. Because the fruit is eaten by animals, and then some of the seeds that are eaten, some of the seeds are going to be eaten along with the fruit. And then they're going to pass through the digestive system of the animal and be pooped out somewhere far from the parent tree or parent plant that fruit came from. And therefore the seeds are going to be dispersed far and wide. So think of birds, fruit-eating birds, fruit-eating bats that are eating fruit and flying long distances and then pooping out those seeds. And those seeds will actually germinate and grow. So they can be dispersed far and wide by animals. That doesn't mean that flowering plants have abandoned wind dispersal, though. So like this maple seed here has a wing on it for wind dispersal, similar to how gymnosperms primarily operate. But also water. There are seeds that are designed to float on water, and they could actually float in the oceans for thousands of miles and then wash up on a beach and germinate. This seed right here is an example of dispersal on the oceans. This is called a sea bean, because it will float on the water in the ocean for thousands of miles, and then wash up on shore and germinate, a sea bean. I chose this image just because it shows the variety of different shapes and sizes and colors of seeds. There is a huge variety. But once a seed finds a suitable place to germinate, it will germinate. And so the process of the seed beginning to grow and the embryo continuing on in its development, leaving dormancy and continuing to develop, that's known as germination. So the seed will germinate, and it will put down, and first it starts to grow without light. And so it'll put down its roots, and it'll lift up its shoots, and it knows which direction is which by two ways, or two sensory systems. One, a plant either growing towards or away from something is known as a tropism. So you'll notice these two terms here. There's phototropism and gravitropism, and those are the two primary tropisms that cause seeds, when they're germinating, or seedlings, to grow in the proper direction. So it doesn't matter how the seed gets buried under the soil, it's always going to grow so that the roots are going down and the shoots are going up. And you can have both plus and minus, or positive and negative tropisms. So in other words, the shoots have positive phototropism. In other words, they go towards the light. And they have negative gravitropism, which means they go against gravity. The shoots go against gravity. The opposite's true for the roots. The roots show negative phototropism. They go away from light, and positive gravitropism. They grow down towards the direction of gravity. And as you might imagine, there are cellular and molecular mechanisms to allow plants to be able to sense these things. And germination is primarily what the stored food supply is all about, the endosperm, because it not only keeps the embryo alive while it's dormant, and so it's using very little to no energy while it's dormant. So most of the food supply is allowing that embryo to start or continue on in its development, to leave dormancy and continue on in its development and develop to the point where it's able to get out of the soil. So the food supply helps the plant grow to the point where it can actually get out of the soil and unfurl its leaves and start to photosynthesize and continue in its development, make its own food. So that's pretty much it for the general characteristics of seed and pollen producing plants and what pollen and seeds are. Now we're going to take a look at the gymnosperms specifically. So again, gymnosperm means naked seed because the seeds are relatively close to the surface on cones developing close to the surface, naked, so to speak. They are covered by scales, or can be covered by scales, so they're not completely naked. But anyway, we've got the phylum Netophyta represented here. And actually this slide, we'll come back to that in a minute because this slide represents the netophytes. This is the only image that you're going to see of a netophyte in this presentation anyway. Then we've got the phylum Cicadophyta, which is the same as the species we were looking at on the introductory slide to today's presentation on seeds and pollen. Then we've got the phylum Ginkgophyta, and there's only one species of ginkgo, and you may have seen these growing around town because they're planted a lot in cities because they can survive pollution really well. So they're very hardy, and they're like a living fossil. They've been around for millions of years unchanged. And then, of course, we've got the phylum Coniferophyta, which you know what you would refer to as a pine tree or an evergreen. So they obviously, I mean, when you think of a cone-bearing plant or a cone producing seed plant, you're going to think of a pine tree or a pine cone. But you got to what I'm hoping you're learning from this course that there are these other plants that are related to pine trees, because they also produce their seeds in cones. And cones are basically just a cluster of scales. So the seeds are developing under scales that are clustered on the plant. And when it comes to the netophyte here, those clusters we can see it along the stem. The clusters of scales, the cones, are actually developing along the stem. And as you can see, there are not that many species of netophytes, only 70 present-day species, only 3 genera. So those are the netophytes. And note here, for all the cone-producing plants, for all the gymnosperms, there's only about 1,000 species total. And I say only because when we get to the angiosperms, you're going to see that that's minuscule compared to the angiosperms, the flowering plants. I also want to point out that this is pretty much in evolutionary order. In other words, netophytes represent a primitive cone-bearing plant, whereas cycads and then ginkgos and conifers, as far as the time in the fossil record, the time of appearance in the fossil record, that's the order of evolution. So after the netophytes came the cycads about 225 million years ago, and cycads at that time grew to be the size of trees, and they still grow to be the size of trees today, or they are trees. And here you can see the seeds developing, and some of the seeds are missing here. So this whole thing represents what was a cone, and it has lost a lot of its seeds already. But these orange things are the individual seeds. And these leaves look a lot like fronds from a fern or even palm branches. But palms are actually flowering plants, and ferns, as you know, are vascular non-seed plants or seedless plants, in other words, spore-producing plants, so they're completely different kinds of plants. So don't confuse them. They are the second largest group of gymnosperms, however. So about, if all the gymnosperms only have about 1,000 species, the cycads represent about 300 of those species, but only 9 genera. So remember genera, there's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus. When we say genera, we mean the genus. So there are a number of species within each genera. So 9 genera, but remember there are numerous species within each genera. And that's how we get 300 species in 9 genera. Then we have phylum Ginkgophyta, and as I noted earlier, there's only one species, one extant species in one genera, the genera Ginkgo. And they are living fossils, so they've been around for about 200 million years, but they have not changed very much in those 200 million years. So the fossils that we find that are 200 million years old look very much like the ginkgos that are alive today. And I changed this slide, so if you looked at this slide previously or have a copy of this slide, you might note that this image has been added because I wanted to show you the difference between the male and the female. These are dioecious. This plant is dioecious, and if you'll recall, dioecious means two house, actually literally translates into two houses, which means that there's a male plant and there's a female plant, two separate sexes of plants. So there's a male ginkgo tree and there's female ginkgo trees. So this is what the male cones look like, because remember, these are gymnosperms, so they form cones. And then these are the ovules. Each of these actually these are seeds, so they are fertilized ovules, but those ovules then haven't developed into the seeds. So that's a ginkgo. And again, you'll find them around town because they do really well in the city. They can handle air pollution and a lot of other environmental difficulties. And that's why they've been able to survive the last 200 million years, whereas others of their species, or not others of their group, others of their phylum have died out. And that brings us to the conifers, what you would normally refer to as a pine tree or maybe a shrub. So we've got pines and spruces, sequoias, junipers as examples here. But we're talking about the phylum Coniferophyta, and it appeared about 140 million years ago, so more recently than the other gymnosperms. About 500 known species, so of all the gymnosperms, all four phyla of gymnosperms, being about 1,000 species total, conifers make up half of them. And of the things most familiar to you about the conifers, pine trees, not only are the pine cones, which is what makes them gymnosperms, but also pine needles. Their leaves have been modified to needles. And, if you've ever thought about or wondered about why pine trees have pine needles, why their leaves have been modified into needles, it's not because of the cold, it's because of the dryness. So we refer to, a lot of these are evergreens. Not all of them are evergreens, however. Evergreens meaning that they would retain their leaves or their needles year-round. Some of them do lose their needles seasonally, and it's not so much that they never lose their needles. If you ever look underneath the pine tree, there's this thick mat of needles that have dropped off the pine tree over time. So they do lose their needles, just not all at once, like deciduous trees do, like broadleaf deciduous trees do. And that's what deciduous means. It means a tree that's going to lose its leaves seasonally. So that's why I have evergreens in quotes here, is because they're not all necessarily evergreens. So like I said, the needles have evolved, the leaves have evolved into needles to survive dryness. Because in the winter, it's not only cold, but the air is very dry. You probably have experienced that in your skin being a lot drier in the winter than in the summer. So there's much less surface area. Needles have much less surface area, and as it says here, they're also covered by a waxy cuticle. We call that a cuticle. So a thick layer of wax seals up the leaf so that it doesn't lose water. So needles are more of an adaptation to a dry habitat than they are to a cold habitat. And that's it for the gymnosperms. Next time we'll take a look at the angiosperms and finish up the unit.